Hello, good morning, good afternoon or evening to all of you that took the time to join our webinar. Our webinar today is about managing risks in the Indonesian PV market. We have quite a multicultural audience from all parts of the world. I just checked the registration: Europe, US, Asia. And I would like to warm welcome and thank you for your time for joining this webinar. My name is Shushan Khachatrian. I'm a project manager in Solarplaza, and I will be chairing this webinar with you and with our speakers. Okay, so this webinar is in preparation to the trade mission to Indonesia that we are organizing from 27th of February till 3rd of March, next month, almost in a month. And I'm also happy to announce our diamond sponsor, Tesan, and gold sponsor, Huawei, for this trade mission. Here you can see the agenda on what to expect from our webinar. So the webinar will last for 1 hour. We start with introduction and key market updates. Afterwards, we will have technical risk mitigation strategies presentation and lowering project financial risk presentation. And I will be also announcing the speakers shortly. Before I start, a few practical notes. The questions, any questions that you might have, you can submit through GoToWebinar's chat box in the right-hand side. Also, if you have any technical issues with audio or with the screen, just let our team know. They will be happy to try to help you. The presentation slides will be available afterwards. So we will send an email after the webinar, including the presentations. Also, you can use our hashtag TSF Indonesia to tweet any questions, comments on Twitter. Before I start, just a quick presentation about Solarplaza for those of you that don't know us. Solarplaza is a knowledge platform of over 50,000 PV professionals with a goal to accelerate the energy transition. Our main business is organizing high-level conferences and trade missions. In the last 10 years, we have organized over 80 events in more than 25 countries, both in Europe, US, but also in the emerging markets. As you can see, we have, in the past years, we have done quite a lot of trade missions, actually in over 25 countries, and among them Indonesia in 2013. So we will be returning to Indonesia this year. So as I said, this trade mission is organized as a preparation to the solar PV trade mission that we are putting together in almost a month. So this is 5 days event for those of you that are interested to explore the Indonesian PV market. This will not only give all the information in 5 days to be able to join the market, but also be an ideal platform to network with key stakeholders, project developers, utilities, banks, investors, manufacturers, and also the government officials. Just a quick overview how it will look like. The first 3 days will be closed-door meetings with the ministry, PLN, with finance and legal companies. And the last 2 days we will host the Solar Future Indonesia conference, which will, where we expect over 150 local and international companies. So also ideal platform to find a local partner for your projects. And here just a brief overview of the preliminary list of companies that are going to be involved in this trade mission. Okay, so I will also, I will be happy to share a few market updates in the past few weeks in Indonesia. For those of you that have been closely following the Indonesian market, might have seen the constant changes that it has gone through, especially for the solar PV. At our last webinar, which was end of October, the Feed-in Tariff Regulation 19 was about to be launched. Only 2 months later, despite a battle to increase the usage of clean energy nationwide, the government has decided not to propose a renewable energy subsidy in the revised 2017 state budget. Even so, the government seems to remain optimistic that development of renewable energy will progress in the next year despite of lack of subsidies, pointing out to the price competitiveness. And I have been just talking to our local partners, and it was informed that the Directorate General of New Renewable Energy and Energy Conservation and the state-owned utility PLN are at the moment in Dubai exploring the PV regulation there. They have a target to update the Regulation 19 and other renewable energy regulations by the end of this month. So hopefully we will have updates there. Also, they have expressed interest to discuss and learn from our trade mission participants about feed-in tariff structures in their countries. So we are expecting interesting discussion during one of the days of our trade mission, where the delegation will be hosted by the Ministry of Energy. Therefore, at the moment, we can see that so far business-to-business approach directly with PLN is the possibility to look at for the coming year. We at Solarplaza have made a list of memorandum of understanding signed between PLN and developers in the past year. You can view the list at our content page of our webinar, and we will keep the list updated for you. Also, business-to-business approach will be widely discussed at the upcoming conference and trade mission. Another interesting update is an interesting opportunity for off-grid and microgrid PV projects. A new electricity privatization regulation has been introduced to help accelerate development in electricity development in 2,500 remote villages across Indonesia. This ministerial decree allows private companies to develop their own electricity grids that are separate from state-owned utility PLN. This will allow private companies and cooperatives to set up off-grid power plant projects in remote villages, most of which are located in the area of Papua and West Papua. There are a few unclarities still with the regulation, especially with how the subsidy will be structured, so we will keep you updated on the further developments at our website. Also at our conference we will discuss this regulation and possibilities with decentralized systems, and we have a very interesting case study at conference about Sumba Iconic Island project, which aims to become 100% renewable to all its 650,000 citizens by 2025. If successful, this can become a role model for other remote villages and remote areas in Indonesia. Okay, so these were all updates from my side on the market, and without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker for today, Philippe Napier-Moore. He is a Solar Program Director of Asia Pacific at Mott MacDonald. He has overseen the regional solar team's technical input to more than 5,000 megawatts of PV projects in Asia, including more than 200 plants now in operation. He is a chartered energy engineer and obtained his Master of Engineering from Oxford University. So Philippe, please open your presentation in a full screen mode. I will now make you a presenter.
So good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here today to share some insights on technical risks and mitigation strategies applicable to the Indonesian solar PV market. Briefly on Mott MacDonald, it's a large international engineering consultancy, for those who haven't heard of it, active across the world. We're a leader in renewable energy advisory work and have offices serving each of the different regions around the world. In the Southeast Asia region specifically, our Bangkok office is our regional headquarters, and we've been working with our national offices in other countries around the region who offer insight into local engineering codes, local permitting standards to deliver solar PV projects across the region. So the reason why we feel we're qualified to talk on this subject is because of our track record working in the region specifically. We've supported about 3 gigawatts of solar in Southeast Asia, and that includes the majority of the currently operating capacity. In Indonesia itself, we've supported about 300 megawatts of solar and wind projects under bilateral PPAs, including successful financing of the country's first wind farm, and have a longer track record in conventional energy support. So we've worked on a lot of the first of a kind solar PV projects at the utility scale in Southeast Asia, including in Malaysia, Thailand, Myanmar, and the Philippines. So hoping to bring some of the insights from that experience into this webinar. So the webinar is structured into 2 parts. One is on design and equipment selection risks that we've seen from our utility scale projects in Southeast Asia specifically, and then addressing the unique challenges of estimating solar resource in Indonesia. So to get into the meat of the presentation, this first slide. One key issue that we've seen since the Southeast Asia solar sector really kicked off in 2009 at the utility scale is whether equipment is suitable to the environment that it's being installed in. Some equipment is being manufactured in other regions where it may be subject to different stresses, and when it's first applied in the region has had problems. So some of the failures and cost overruns that we've seen have been because of equipment selection, and that may be as simple as specifying for adequate humidity or temperature given corrosion potential, or it may be because of a failure to anticipate and understand the natural hazards in the region, particularly flood risk. So some specific examples here would be on electrical enclosure design. So this includes combiner boxes, inverter housing, includes motor actuators for tracking. We've seen it's a common issue across many projects has been failures in these equipment items due to them not being specified for the correct temperature. In particular, I mean, nowadays we're seeing more and more containerized or outdoor inverters, including string inverters, skid-based solutions for central inverters. But in particular, when there's a dedicated housing built for an inverter, that sometimes hasn't been built for the high temperatures, it hasn't been able to cool the inverter adequately, and we've seen inverters burn out or explode as a result of that. Similarly, you may just get nuisance tripping because of humidity sensor trips, various issues around that. So, I mean, one obvious issue there is just to take note of the experience of suppliers in the region, whether that's including a proper shelter for the enclosure to ward off heat gain from insulation and allow for shelter during heavy rainfall for maintenance. But these issues have already been solved in many cases, and it's just a matter of being aware of them. The second category here is common design shortcomings, and this is primarily on the civil side. And there's nothing necessarily resembling rocket science about the civil design, but it is the area where we most commonly see design shortfalls, particularly where the intensity of the rainfall hasn't been adequately taken into account for flood mitigation design and in the design and implementation of civil works. So as a result of those kind of issues, we've seen significant numbers of failures of embankments and of mounting structures, which is just, again, something to be aware of, that local contractors familiar with the electrical design may need support to get these kind of issues right. And just a few pictures there just to show, not necessarily the most extreme, but a few of the issues that we have seen due to either inadequate compaction or inadequate accounting for drainage. The second category of design-related risks that we've seen, or technical risks that can actually lead to shortfalls in revenues. And I think, as you would see from statistics around the world, inverter outages are the key driver of availability and therefore revenue loss. But some of the reasons may be different for projects in the Southeast Asia region. Some of the nuisance trips that we see are often because of low isolation resistance. So there's the inverter believes there is a short circuit simply because the cables are inundated, they're underwater, and you can trace that back to either problems in cable installation, if there's any kind of damage to the cable during installation, or ultimately inadequate drainage. So adequate drainage, the civil design can directly impact on the plant production and the electrical performance of the electrical system here. Other issues around the actual grid itself and the stability of the grid and how the inverter responds to that. We've seen some inverter suppliers respond badly to the variability on distribution grids in particular. Another key issue is, as anywhere, does the inverter supplier actually have a local maintenance base? Do they have local spare storage? You see the same nightmare stories of inverters being down for 5 months because the technician or the spare part couldn't make it from the other side of the world. And a lot of these issues would be particularly challenging for projects in remote islands. Addressing these issues becomes more challenging in terms of the maintenance, and grids are often weaker, so there's more of a significant risk of over or under voltage causing inverter trips on those grids. So really that's the lesson here, I think, is about correctly choosing an inverter, correctly designing the equipment around that inverter, and understanding the grid properties. So now I want to move on to what I want to spend the most time on in this presentation today, which is irradiation data sources in Indonesia, because I think this is an area that we can all understand a bit better, and we're fortunate to have been speaking with the local meteorological agency, the BMKG, so it's the Indonesian Agency for Meteorology, Climatology and Geophysics, and getting to understand a bit more what data they have and how that can help solar PV developers. So that's obviously ground measured data at meteorological stations in Indonesia. On the other side of things, we have the satellite-derived data that we have all around the world. And in particular, we've seen SolarGIS, 3-tier and Meteor-Norm be widely used in the Southeast Asia region. Now, I think just to take a step back here in terms of irradiance data selection, you know, our view, our opinion is that irradiance data selection can be fundamentally more challenging in parts of Southeast Asia which have complex microclimates, particularly kind of archipelago climates, so particularly around Philippines, Indonesia. The standard approaches that we see internationally work well internationally, may not be applicable to Indonesia. We may need to work harder to actually understand our solar resource. And that's what I'm going to talk around today. So talking about that satellite data from SolarGIS or 3-tier, I mean, this is essentially data that's images from satellites, and that's extrapolated down to irradiance levels at the ground level using assumptions about the composition of the atmosphere. And that can be available with raw input data of roughly 5 kilometers resolution and enhanced up to 250 meters or 1 kilometer. So a pretty tight grid that you've got available to tell you irradiation in any given part of the world. In addition to that, Meteor-Norm is available as a typical meteorological year. You can't buy that representing every hour over the long term. It represents a sort of average over time. One drawback with that is that we can't easily check it. We can't check how it stacks up against ground data. So it's very hard to know, is it accurate or not? Whereas the advantage with the SolarGIS and 3-tier is you can buy that as a long-term time series. So you could look specifically at 2014, 2015, every hour interval during those 2 years and see, is this satellite data doing a good job and representing conditions on the ground? And I think I'm going to highlight that satellite data is essential in this part of the world, but it does need validating. You do need to understand, is it accurate? And so I'll talk more about that in the subsequent slides. One data source that's available that I haven't included in this slide is NASA data. That's simply because we see it as too low resolution to represent the complexity of the climates in this region. So what ground data is available? There's actually two types of instrumentation, which is fairly unusual in our experience. Normally we would only see pyranometer data, but BMKG has been taking long-term measurements using a different type of sensor called a Gunn-Bellani radiometer. This is manually reset daily and it relies on the principle of evaporation and condensation of alcohol or water. So it gives you essentially daily resolution data. And it's available for the long term, so that's the Pro. It's available for up to 20 years in stations across Indonesia. However, and various studies show that the accuracy of this can be pretty good and can stack up against a pyranometer on a daily basis. The con would obviously be it needs manual intervention on a daily basis, and there's more room for human error. On the other hand, we do have pyranometer data for up to 2 years of data for various locations across Indonesia, and those Gunn-Bellani radiometers are still installed, so we can cross-check the radiometer data against the pyranometer data to get some confidence as to whether that really is in line, as well as just doing basic data quality screening. And I'll show you exactly where those stations are now. So here's the map of stations across the country. There's more than 60 locations here, so that's in principle very good news. We should have a good body of data for validating our satellite readings. The caveat is that only one station here that I've highlighted as a meteor norm interpolation station is actually currently referenced in international data providers' validations as a long-term source of data. So all of this data is available, but the feedback that we've actually had from BMKG, and I'd be very interested to hear if anyone else has different perspective, is that nobody has ever bought any of this irradiation data. No private company has ever requested BMKG for this data, and so right now we have to acknowledge that there's a lack of awareness about the quality of all of these stations, how much data is really available and how good quality is it. And that's going to be an important point to find out in moving forward solar resource analysis within Indonesia. So we do have the satellite data across Indonesia, and I think one important point I'd like to start with is the variation in conditions that we can see from this satellite data. So if we're in many parts of the world, people still use this rule of thumb that if you're in 20 kilometers from a ground measurement station, then that data should be reasonably applicable to your site. However, what we see in many archipelagos, complex island climates, with island climates driven by the coastal and mountain effects and how those affect cloud cover, we see that assumption really doesn't stack up, and in places like Philippines, Japan, we've routinely seen variations of up to 20% within that 20-kilometer stretch. So if you move 20 kilometers from that met station, your resource could be 20% higher or lower than what that ground station was providing, which is why we need to use this kind of satellite data. But in Indonesia, it's actually even more extreme. We've seen parts of Indonesia, several parts of Indonesia, where the variation can be up to 45% in the 20-kilometer range, from the 1,300 up to 2,000. And you can see an example here in Sulawesi in the bottom right of the screen, where you have a very steep variation in irradiation conditions going from the coast inland to the mountains. It's not that you're likely to actually put plants in those mountainous areas. It's more just an illustration of how extreme the variations can be, and therefore how careful we need to be in interpreting ground measured data. So we have this satellite data. It's good news, but is it accurate? And the answer to that is unclear. there's two validation sites that are referenced for this particular SolarGIST data, and this is essentially because this is really all the data that's available, ground measured data currently available for validation. One site shows a pretty good match over here in Sumatra, 0.6% bias, so very, very close to the ground measurements. Another shows that the satellite data is actually almost 5% too low in this location in Kalimantan. So is that enough? Why is this a concern? And I'm going to turn to a case study in Japan to answer that question. So the benefit of Japan is we have lots and lots of ground measured data extending back to the 1960s, gathered by the Japan Meteorological Agency. It's very easy for us to compare different data sources. And this map is just an illustration of how one satellite data source compares with those ground measured data from JMA, screening out ground measured data that we consider suspect. And what you can see is a very wide range in the performance of the satellite data across the archipelago. And in fact, there's some stations where the bias is up to 12%, so the satellite data is overstating the resource by 12%. And somewhere the satellite data is under-predicting by a few percent. So in total, there might be a 15% range between whether the satellite data is over or under-predicting in this kind of complex climate. And that, I think, is the point that we need to grasp. Is the satellite data doing a good job? It may vary widely depending on which part of the country we're in. And a validation result from one part of the archipelago will not necessarily apply to others. So in Indonesia, we're dealing with a country that extends across longitudes of more than 5,000 kilometers, wider than the US. And the validation results we have right now just simply aren't adequate to tell us how the satellite data is performing in each part of the country. And so without the ground data, we can't really make good estimates until we further investigate this, until this is better understood. The science really is not as mature as in other parts of the world, and that's because conditions vary so much more steeply and there's so much less data. Another complicating factor is pollution. So pollution actually does explain some of these variations in the performance of the satellite data we see in Japan. Some of the stations that are affected by high levels of atmospheric aerosols from urban air pollution, for example, have high levels of bias because the satellite data effectively cannot see that pollution at adequate resolution. So it doesn't really capture it for a specific station. And so talking about pollution, here's a map of some various particulate matter indices across Indonesia from the World Health Organization. And really this is just to show again there's wide variability in the pollution across the country, and the levels of pollution can be very high. You can see the red triangle there represents particulate matter of 10 microns or below of greater than 100 micrograms per meter cube. So that's very high. Most parts of Southeast Asia, even relatively polluted cities, we're typically talking 50 micrograms or below. So that pollution will not be captured by the satellite data. So if your site is affected by that and you use the satellite data, you will be over-predicting your resource. And so this is another reason why we need the ground-based data and another issue we need to understand. And one of the things that's driving that pollution is burning of peat forest. As you can see from this map here in Sumatra, Kalimantan, in the past there's been regular annual peat forest fires causing haze across other parts of the region, not only restricted to Indonesia itself. So that's a wrap really on the irradiation side, just really trying to point out that more work is required. Just a couple of points on performance estimation as well. I've highlighted some areas where we believe there's room for improvement in the way that performance of plants is estimated. I won't go into too much detail now unless people have questions. I think the main point I wanted to bring up here was that we're monitoring more than a couple of hundred plants in the region for lenders and have a lot of operating data. So we published papers showing that we can pretty accurately estimate the performance of these plants within 1%, and it's possible to get that level of accuracy. Okay, so to wrap up and leave a little bit of time for questions, I wanted to say that for projects with good access to site, the lessons from elsewhere in the Southeast Asia region regarding design and equipment selection remain relevant. And for those of you that might have caught the previous webinar where Andres Sasanto presented in October last year, there are also projects with access infrastructure limitations, whether that's roads or ports. So that's another point which has been covered before, where careful assessment may be required on the technical side. Grid-related constraints on power sales is a central concern for island networks and can both lead to periods of uncompensated downtime and to inverter trips, and needs to be carefully assessed. And solar resource estimation is not yet an adequately mature science for the Indonesian climate, and so where we might see established tools and approaches from other regions work very well in simpler climates, there's no evidence that those work here, and there's a good likelihood that they won't work well. So we do need to consider both ground-measured and satellite-derived data for any quantifiable level of confidence in revenue estimates, and that's to capture both the long-term climates, the modeling uncertainty, the microclimate effects, and any impacts from air pollution. So thank you for your attention. I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Philippe, for the presentation. I already received a few questions directly related to your presentation, so perhaps it's easier to already ask to you. So first question is, for the slide you showed with the BMKG station locations, are the red dots all based on pyranometers? So yeah, maybe you can show that again.
So we're in dialogue with BMKG, and we're trying to get a lot more detail about when exactly specific stations were established. But what we've been told is that pyranometers have been installed at each of these red dots within the last 2 years. We're not clear exactly how much data is available from each of those.
Okay, thank you, Philippe. And another question, do you have the same stations in the rest of Southeast Asia, for example, Philippines?
In the Philippines, there's 4 or 5 ground stations that were established in the last few years. So we did work for the Philippine Solar Power Alliance as part of the feed-in tariff setting in the last round, and compiled all of that data. It's quite limited. It's assuming all of this data from BMKG comes through, the data in the Philippines would actually be more limited than in Indonesia. Yeah.
Okay. Another question, what are your recommendations on degradation assumptions for CSI modules in the region?
Well, in principle, I think the same drivers of linear degradation apply, assuming no accelerated failure mechanisms are in evidence. So we would take into account the data available from operating plants in other parts of the world, and we would look at the accelerated life testing of the modules. But right now, we're not aware of any reason to apply different linear degradation assumptions if modules are not failing.
Okay, and the last question I will take for now. Somebody asked that they want to know, due to the Indonesian climate, which type of panel should be used and what to consider.
Well, clearly cadmium telluride has an advantage in terms of specific yield in Southeast Asia because of its better spectral response. But I don't think that's not in any way a recommendation or an endorsement. It's just one factor to weigh against the economics of the project, the broader economics of the project. So okay. No particular recommendation. All forms of current forms of dominant PV module technology could apply.
Okay, Thank you, Philippe. Thank you very much for your presentation. There might be more questions, but we will take them at the end of the webinar. So I will now switch your screen to mine. Yes, so our next speaker will be presenting the financial risks and how to manage them in the Indonesian solar market. So Geoffrey Tan, Managing Director Asia Pacific at the Overseas Private Investment Corporation at OPIC. So he's the regional representative of OPIC based in Bangkok, Thailand. He's actually right now in Myanmar, so a few challenges with the internet connection, but I think that he's now live. He has over 19 years of experience in the emerging markets, infrastructure financing, primarily on power, renewable energy, water, toll roads, and port projects. Geoffrey, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you well. Right now, I will make you a presenter, so please have your presentation open in a full screen mode, and I will make you a presenter in a moment.
Okay. You have it?
Yes, we have your screen right now, so yeah, please go ahead.
Okay, great. Apologies, first of all, for not being able to join earlier. I have some internet difficulties, so I missed, unfortunately, Shushan's and Philip's presentation, but hopefully I can add to what they've said. And I'm going to keep it fairly broad and high level, sort of an introductory presentation. So for those of you who are familiar with some of the basics, please appreciate the patience. And hopefully we can get into more details through Q&A. So I'm going to start with a little bit of background on OPIC, because we're not a very well-known agency. So to give you a little bit of context for why OPIC is kind of well-placed to give comments here. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the financial risks in the Indonesian market and how we might address those in the context of the solar program and solar PV projects. Okay. So very quickly, OPIC, which stands for Overseas Private Investment Corporation, is the U.S. government's development finance institution. We focus on private sector investments in emerging markets. We have a portfolio of about 21 billion now. I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. Some data points on our impact I'll let you read through at your leisure. Just to let you know what we do, we provide loans and loan guarantees, political risk insurance, and we also have a private equity program. Most of what we do, 75 to 80% right now, is in loans and loan guarantees. So we do a lot of project financing, you know, in the power space, for example. Okay. Clients and partners, again, you can take a look for yourself, range from large to small, public and private. Note that our clients are only private, but clearly we can also collaborate with other publics. This slide, when does OPIC get involved? The important point here is that, as you can see from this little pyramid, you know, the bottom is where there's really, you know, public sector kind of development assistance work from people like the World Bank and USAID, helping governments get their, you know, renewable energy programs going, etc. The next stage of identifying specific opportunities and perhaps supporting technical feasibility studies and other preparatory work, I can also characterize as more public sector, but that's when the private sector starts to be involved. And then we're involved kind of after that when, you know, there's been a filtering of sorts and the private sector really has determined that there's a project that makes sense and they're, you know, ready to invest and looking for financing. all to say that we don't engage in official development assistance or that type of subsidized lending or grant provision. Really focused on sustainable kind of private sector investment. That's what we're here to catalyze. Okay, and that'll come through later on. Policy standards, as you might expect. The projects that we support must have U.S. involvement. Again, I'll leave you to read that at your leisure. Investment priorities, renewable energy is clearly a big one. We've done approximately 8 billion, if not more, of commitments to renewable energy globally, that being primarily utility scale wind and solar, but also others. Okay, project life cycle, just very quickly, I'm not going to go through this, but when you look at it later, hopefully you'll see that it's very akin to what a commercial bank does. So we go through the whole due diligence procedure from A to Z. Again, really with the intent of making sure the projects that we support are robust and sustainable. We want the projects that we support to have the developmental impact desired and not to, of course, run into troubles that could otherwise be avoided and be, as we say, one step forward and 2 steps back kind of situation. Very quickly in Asia Pacific, again, just to give you a little bit of context, Asia Pacific means Myanmar and everything to the east, so excludes South Asia. If you look at that part of our portfolio, it's less than 1 billion, again, of the 21 billion or so it's fairly small, something we're focused on changing. That's why I'm in Bangkok. It's one of only 5 offices around the world for OPIC. The others are primarily focused on Africa. We have a Big Power Africa, for those of you who are familiar with that. A Big Power Africa push, a lot of resources there. In Asia Pacific, it's just myself at this point, but something that's slowly changing. One example of that change is this project, just very quickly. It's the first, what they call new renewable IPP in Indonesia. So that means not hydro, not geothermal, because those have been done before, obviously. So this is the first, wind or solar, basically, project that's been financed on a project finance basis. 75 megawatts on the island of Sulawesi in the south. It's a negotiated deal with PLN, so not part of a FIT program. 30-year PPA, bankable, international standards, negotiated tariff. We can talk about that in some of the later slides. There's no government support, and we will also talk about that later, but in Indonesia, until last year, basically, the last 18 months, no international project financings in the power sector moved forward without some sort of government support. So we'll come back to that. And then, as you've seen in other markets, emerging and otherwise, utilities and governments have concerns about grid capacity, grid ability to take the intermittent power and so on. I think that here, in this project, it was addressed very well by the sponsors early on. What did OPIC do here? We're providing $120 million senior debt, 16.5 years, and doing that in collaboration with an international bank, international commercial bank. Okay, so that's background. Project financial risks. A lot of these, I think, are ones you're familiar with. So in the subsequent slides, I'll try to focus my comments on those which are unique to Indonesia. And we'll be looking at things that here, as I say, are associated with financial structuring. Obviously, there are a lot of interrelated parts in a project financing, but here I'm not going to be talking about, what Phil talked about, so the resource, technical feasibility, but also I'm not going to be talking about environmental and social risk, legal and regulatory and political. But again, I may touch upon them as everything is interrelated. So I'll be focusing on really the construction period and how we mitigate the risks for that, as well as the operating period, so revenue and costs, and then look at debt. Talk about some aspects that you may want to keep in mind, and then wrap it up. So financial risk of construction issues, you know well, I think unique to Indonesia, there are foreign ownership limitations based on the size of the plant that you're looking at. So basically, if you're looking at anything under 1 megawatt, there's no foreign ownership allowed. Between 1 and 10, you can own up to 49% of a project, and if you go above, you can do 95%. So this creates issues with respect to, you know, maybe it's just the 5% for a larger than 10 megawatt facility, or maybe it's, you know, a lot for 51% for a smaller one that you need to somehow raise, so to speak, in coordination with your local partner. And local partners, as those of you with experience anywhere in emerging markets may know, a lot of them, especially in the smaller solar space, have limited resources, and so we'll be looking to have carried interest and so forth. Something that not unique to Indonesia, just flagging it so that you're aware that this is an issue kind of structurally. Also in context of construction, local partner, we were talking about equity, you know, local community, you need to secure the land in advance. Land is a big issue in Indonesia in terms of securing it for project finance purposes. So that is somewhere where you'll need to be able to deploy capital to put those in place. Not necessarily, you know, pay for them, etc., but get to the point of, you know, advanced discussions and signed agreements with folks, you know, to put in the time and the resources and the costs associated with that process for that to be in place. I won't cover things you know already, such as foreign exchange, talking about construction financing. Obviously, I think we would all be looking for long-term, you know, financing for the asset, not just construction. But just so you're aware, you can get construction financing from local banks or even international banks, but clearly that's those are going to be reliant on sponsor support and come with takeout risk. At this point, long-term financing, and we'll get back to that in more detail, is really DFI or development finance institution driven, be it solo or in coordination with commercial banks, international commercial banks. And then the other parts, I think you're not unique. High domestic rupiah rates, lower USD rates, but of course you need to deal with FX to a certain extent, and we'll go through that a little bit later. And then contingencies to cover overruns and delays. Okay, so operations. Here again, I'm not going to focus on things that are necessary, but might be on the slide, but are fairly basic. What I'll focus on are the Government of Indonesia support and the PPA, and then some other aspects that are related to what I think Phil went through as well. So power purchase agreement, two things. One is with the FIT program. You know, the PPA that's available for that, to my knowledge, has not been made available, so nobody knows what it looks like. But the FIT program is not the only way to invest in solar PV projects. You can do a negotiated deal. There's a process for that as well. That's of course intended to make it as transparent and, you know, a proper, fair as possible. And that may be a more interesting route as well, because it doesn't come with the requirements that the FIT program does in terms of local content and so forth. The PPA, if you can negotiate it and work off of the templates that have been provided, so to speak, by deals that have been financed in the international market, such as the one that we are doing, excuse me, and a few others in the recent past, but those are, again, traditional fuel sources, then you're in, I think, good shape. But it is a negotiation, and those transactions are rupiah-based, but with US dollar indexation. The FX part of that, there's a little bit of remaining FX risk. We can talk about that, and I'll talk about that in the next slide. So focus here really on Government of Indonesia support. PLN relies heavily on government subsidies, like many utilities around the world. There's kind of a long-term plan to address that, but in the short to medium term, you know, that doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. PLN does, however, have an investment grade rating, but that's on the back of the government of Indonesia support that is implied and expected, and Indonesia is investment grade. Now it's very hard to get transactions, whether they be renewable or otherwise, with government of Indonesia support. They've moved strongly away from it. Recently there's been kind of an exception, talk of an exception made possible by a presidential directive. But again, though those exceptions are to be made, as it implies, on a very, you know, unique situations where basically PLN in this case has to be the one requesting the government of Indonesia support to make it go forward. For a little bit more context, I don't want to dwell on this too much, but you know, the one that we're financing now does not have it, as I mentioned. How do we get comfortable with it? Well, OPIC has financed power projects in Indonesia in the past, since the mid-90s, post-Asia financial crisis. You know, we've had a very good experience with PLN, but of course that was with the government of Indonesia guarantee. But looking at the broader spectrum of PLN and IPPs and payments and where they're moving, and also again in the context of where the overall sector is headed long term, we felt comfortable. But perhaps more importantly is we felt comfortable with this specific project, that its price point was competitive for the grid where it's located, that it's complementary to the other fuel sources, and of course that the need is there. So fundamentally, you know, the project works. If you look at all of Indonesia, you know, tariffs, you know, it does not look perhaps that competitive, but if you look at the grid where it is and the cost of fuel, cost of power there, it is competitive. Okay, one other point, I know we're running out of time here, is in connection with what Phil said. You know, a lot of these sites may be remotely located. So in terms of, you know, making sure you've got a robust financial structure, make sure you really understand what it takes to develop those sites, maintain those sites, and part of that is not just technical and so forth, panels and replacements and maintenance and wires, but also, you know, making sure the community is on board and aware and involved. Okay, so debt. Not going, terms on the left side of your screen there, I'm not going to go through any of that. It's not particularly unique. I would say on the right side then that, as mentioned before, DFIs are critical at this stage. Deals are starting to be financed without government of Indonesia support, but so far they've been very limited. The examples are, there's one deal where basically it's you know, a large client that kind of strong-armed their banks into financing it without a guarantee. Another case is where there's been heavy involvement by ECAs, another, you know, multilateral support, and then one project I think that just closed in the past couple of months without another co-deal, but again with heavy kind of sovereign ECA type multilateral support, or bilateral and multilateral support. So it's very early days. You won't find any commercial banks except perhaps one that would do Indonesia power project finance without government guarantee. So they all look to you know, the likes of MEGA, ADB, ourselves, IFC, for political risk cover. There are local DFIs who are involved in power, but frankly, as best I can tell, are more focused on other areas of infrastructure where they can add more value. But just to be complete, I do put them there. And then local commercial banks, have not developed any PF capability to speak of. That's unfortunate. Other markets, other banks, like Philippines and Thailand, for example, even Malaysia, they have. But for the short to medium term, they're not an option for financing. In the summary here, really general comments on the left side, saying key things are got to have a good project, right? The fundamentals need to be there. That will translate itself, hopefully, with the right approach to good relationships, good opportunities for good relationships with local partners, government, both local as well as needed at the federal level. PLN also, again, local level versus headquarters, and then importantly with the community, including landowners. And like most emerging markets, you have to kind of be in here for the long haul to develop those relationships and for people to take you seriously, if you want to do things right. And again, just robust preparation. In terms of financing, sound out the market early, talk to folks and say, got this, what do you think, how does it look, what's your appetite, and so forth. More broadly across the development finance community, there are also some institutions, unfortunately not OPIC included, that have other tools and more concessionary or grant financing tools to put to work for certain types of projects, typically fairly niche. So depending on what you're working on, definitely worth exploring that. And I think the reason why DFIs are so critical and valued by all sides, including the local government, but also commercial banks if we're working with them, or even yourselves, is that obviously we play a role in risk mitigation, both in structuring a deal as well as its implementation. So I'm going to leave it at that and open it up, if I may, for questions.
Thank you very much, Jeff, for the very interesting presentation. We have got a few questions for you and for Philip, so I will go ahead and unmute Philip as well. Philip, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear.
Yes, perfect. So first question is for Jeff. Yes, Jeff, solar PV size is quite small, and can OPIC provide debt on small size PV projects such as 20 to 40 megawatts?
It's a good question. Thank you for that. Quick admin question for Shushan. Can I switch off my screen, or do you want my screen still on?
Yes. No, I will just switch you off in a second while you answer.
Sure. Thank you. So, yes, we can finance smaller transactions. When I say utility scale, I'm thinking, 30 megawatts and up. And we've done those, on a very, normal kind of business as usual basis. I think once we start to get to, 20, 10, 5, these days, it starts to be more difficult. We did those in the early days of emerging markets solar PV, but nowadays, it's a little bit harder to get people excited about that, given the opportunities for larger investments, installations, and the reason is, project financing, right? Project financing, as you all know, a lot of transaction costs, harder to bear on a smaller project than large, so it also makes it, somewhat daunting for sponsors. But in principle, we're happy to do it. For the smaller projects, we're very keen to look at potential structures where we're looking at a portfolio approach for a pipeline, a strong pipeline with a good developer. We're happy to look at that as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question about debt financing in Indonesia, OPIC debt financing. You probably mentioned this as well. Must the sponsor be a US company or any other requirements related to the nationality?
So for OPIC, thank you for the question. So for OPIC, there does need to be some material US private sector involvement in the project, so at the borrower level. So when you say sponsor, I presume you mean equity. Equity is one form of participation that could qualify a deal, right? So if there was US equity. But the other formats of participation include debt. So we had a US co-lender, which is unlikely these days. But possible. And then U.S. services contract is the other opportunity, where if you have, a U.S. EPC or a U.S. O&M contract or some sort of service agreement, we could also look at that. And there's a materiality hurdle, and perhaps we can get into that if we have time. I don't want to take up too much time, but the slides outline that as well.
Thank you, Jeff. I will take last question, given that we are a bit over time. The question is for both speakers. So given the still evolving regulation, how would the speakers see the short to mid-term prospects for the implementation of decent-sized grid-connected solar PV projects in Indonesia? So, Jeff, maybe you can start, and Philip also can comment.
Sure. I think the opportunities are there, and they're not great ones, to be sure. I mean, at least in the short term. I'm happy to hear other perspectives, but I think for medium to larger size grid connected, the challenge is that land is hard to get in Indonesia. It's fairly dense, at least in Java and some of the other more populated areas. And so let's assume you have that. How do you move forward? I think the key there is to start engaging with, of course, the community and the PLN locally, as well as the relevant folks in Jakarta, and do a negotiated deal, because the FIT comes with a lot of complications, at least as far as I can see it. And again, the regulations and the implementation are not clear on the FIT. So I say that with a little bit of caution, but that uncertainty, of course, then creates that potential for complications, right? The negotiated path is the one that our sponsor in the wind deal took. So based on that experience, again, it's a process that needs to be approached in the right way, in a very transparent manner. And again, if you've got a good project, you can demonstrate that it makes sense for PLN, as well as the community, etc. That goes a long way, and you need to work with them to get them comfortable with it. And if you get a PPA out of that, I think you'll have a number of interested parties willing to look at financing.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. Philip, do you have anything to add to that?
Sure. I'd echo Jeff that the bilaterally negotiated PPA path is the proven one at this point. It's because it has been demonstrated, and because there are so many additional bilateral PPAs signed for projects that haven't yet proceeded to financial close. I think that is grounds for optimism. I mean, from a technical perspective, the challenges in development would be to get the data you need on the grid to do a proper grid study. There's not an official way of doing that, but it's been done. To negotiate satisfactory PPA terms that are bankable and allocate the grid risk in a suitable way, which again has now been done. And then on the solar resource side, I mean, in principle, there's a simple solution of just putting a pyrometer on site. And so to the extent that you have confidence in your land and your projects, and you've already progressed your negotiations with PLN and understand the grid risks, then that's a simple way to resolve any residual uncertainty the other available data sources cannot resolve that. So from a technical perspective, I think it's quite an encouraging picture at this point of time for the bilaterally negotiated PPAs.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentations, Philippe, Jeff, and for your time for doing that and taking the questions. I would like to also thank our audience for staying with us and remind that both Philippe and Jeff will be speakers at our trade mission and the conference in Indonesia in almost a month. Yes, and last slide, just would like to let you all know about our upcoming events. We will travel quite a lot to Nigeria, Argentina, to San Francisco, and of course, as I mentioned, Indonesia. So I'm looking forward to seeing some of you at our event, and thank you very much once again for joining this webinar. I wish you all a very good day. Bye-bye.